It has been more than a week since four University of Idaho students were found stabbed to death in a home near campus, and police have not identified who killed them. Three of the victims lived at the house where the attack occurred. The fourth was there visiting his girlfriend. Police believe they were targeted. With us now is retired agent and former FBI profiler Mary Ellen OToole. She's the director of George Mason University's Forensic Science Program. Mary Ellen, it's great to talk to you again, although sadly, tragically, we're always talking to you when something horrific has happened. So when you look at this story, Mary Ellen, what sticks out to you about this case and what investigators are looking for?
Well, there are a couple of things that really stand out to me. And I know investigators said that the victims were targeted, and that's a behavioral term that has a lot of meaning to me. So the question is, how are they making that determination? And were they all equally targeted? And the way that assessment has to be made is to see if any of the victims were treated differently in that crime scene. In other words, if one victim received more injuries or was treated differently after the stabbing occurred. And that usually tells you that that person could have been the focus of the attack. And then secondly, this offender had to leave a lot of evidence at that crime scene. He was not evidence conscious, and so there will be forensic evidence. For example, it's likely that the offender cut themselves with the knife. After you stab that many times, your hand goes down on the blade and you cut yourself and you leave blood there, and that's DNA evidence. And so that evidence is going to be extremely important. And then finally, just based on going inside somebody else's home in the middle of the night with other people there to commit a quadruple homicide suggests to me that that person has likely been in that home prior to this attack, and that this individual, this offender, has prior experience being in other people's homes.
So, Mary Ellen, I'm wondering about the time frame here. Are there any gaps in the timeline from when the victims were last seen and when they were found dead?
It does seem that there's some gaps because, and that information may not ever be able to be filled in because the victims themselves would be the ones to tell you, we got home at this time and then we went to bed at that time. So I don't know that that will ever be completed, but the question remains, at what point did the offender get inside that house? And were all the victims, they were in their beds is what it sounds like, but were they all asleep? If they were not all equally asleep in a deep sleep, that could also explain some of the defensive injuries on several of the victims, although that's not been clarified. So that timeline is getting narrower and narrower, but I'm not sure it will ever be pinned down 100%.
Mary Ellen, the murder weapon, what kind of murder weapon, what are you hearing about what could have been used? I just keep thinking that it's such a brutal attack. To use an object to murder, four people, I'm trying to understand. It's just impossible to understand because doesn't it strike you, Mary Ellen, and you're the expert here, that this would be of an extreme personal nature to use a weapon like that, an object like that, to murder four people, as opposed to a gun, which we've covered these mass shootings, and oftentimes the perpetrators don't know any of the victims, at least in the last couple of weeks, the ones that we've been reporting on. What does that tell you?
Well, when an offender uses a knife, they have to get close up and personal with the victim. And that means that they can see their face, they interact with them, especially if the victim is fighting back, and they see the victim slowly losing their life. Here's what I'd also say about this knife. It had to be a pretty sturdy knife because it survived the stabbing of four people multiple times. Now, the medical examiner who performed the autopsy, they traditionally don't say, well, the weapon used here was exactly this. They can tell you elements of the instrument, but in my experience, they don't traditionally say it is exactly this, especially if you're dealing with a sharp-bladed instrument. But I'd also say that this offender, even though sloppy in the crime scene, leaving so much evidence, he was very efficient with this knife. He was able to complete 4 homicides and then leave the scene. That tells me this person has experience with that knife, a very effective cutting instrument, and that whether or not he would then or she would then throw that instrument away in the woods someplace is doubtful to me, because this is an instrument that's important to that offender. And I do think, based on the efficiency of those homicides, that the knife has been used before, not necessarily in another murder, but that the offender has used it before in other instances.
It's absolutely chilling, Mary Ellen, to hear you talk about that and efficiency when we're talking about the taking of human lives. I mean, based on what we know so far, what type of person or potentially group of people is most likely to commit an act like this?
Based on what I know so far, and again, that's coming from the media, this kind of violence is indicative of what we call instrumental violence, which is different from the traditional violence called reactive violence. Reactive violence is if I punch you in the nose and you punch me back, that's reactive violence. But this instrumental violence is violence that is cold-blooded, it's predatory, and it's very callous type of violence perpetrated frequently on strangers. And this type of violence is oftentimes the kind of violence that we seek used by people that are psychopathic. The old-fashioned term was sociopath. But psychopathic individuals, not mentally ill, so I want to make that clear right away, but they are people who are profoundly lacking in empathy and guilt for their behavior. And when they do commit crimes, their crimes have a very high-risk element to it because they enjoy the thrill of whatever the crime is. If it's killing people, they enjoy having it be even more high risk than it needs to be. And this was a very high-risk crime. When you go into somebody's home in the middle of the night and kill them, that's very high risk.
Do you believe that there's a threat to the community?
I do. Yes, I do. And I'll tell you why I think that. If somebody has the capability of doing this, these wounds going into that home, these injuries, these wounds were not an effort to scare the victims or to threaten the victims. They were intended to kill the victims. And if an offender has this capability, even though maybe one or two of the victims were targeted and the others were not, but were still killed, this offender, because of that behavior, that high-risk impulsive type of behavior, is capable of repeating it again in the right set of circumstances. So based on that, I would say that this is he or she or they are at high risk for reoffending.
So deeply disturbing to hear your assessment, but important, right, in the absence of any additional public information at this point as people try to understand what happened there. Mary Ellen OToole, Mary Ellen, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.